Hello, hello. Happy Tuesday. I'm hoping that this is going to work. Last time I had some issues with recording, but I think that this is going to display this correctly this time. And we're just going to go through and I'm going to go ahead and try and knock these notes out so I can get a recording up there for those of you who might not be able to make it to the online class, or for those of you who just, if I go too fast or what have you, whatever it might be, so that you can go back and check out some of this stuff on more of your own pace. Mrs. Miller said these notes should take about 35 minutes, so I'm going to do my best to keep it to that. But I do have an issue sometimes with talking too much, so I do apologize if they go a little bit longer. I am going to do my best. It's just an adjustment that I'm trying to get a little bit better at. So uh, that also means that maybe it might seem like I'm rushing a little bit on this too. So please do forgive me. Be a little patient with me this week while I get used to some of this stuff. Some of this material is stuff that I haven't seen in a long time too. So either way, I'm sure it'll be fine. And let's go ahead and get started. So we're chapter 2 right now, the origins of American government. We're starting at the ground level. All right. We have early government. A lot of the stuff, some of the stuff is going to lead you up to kind of the Declaration of Independence. It's going to lead you up to 1776, July 4th, all those wonderful dates that we know about. To begin, the early government in the colonies. A lot of this is heavily influenced by the English, as you would imagine. We are basically, children of the Commonwealth of the English, right? They brought three basic concepts of government. They had ordered government, regulated interaction between people, right? That's more orderly. There's limited government, as you can imagine. The government is less involved. The government's not all powerful. Individuals have more rights. And the government can't take away a lot of those rights. So something that maybe you could get on board with, right? Something that maybe you're cool with. Representative government, something that we all know a lot about, considering we kind of experience a representative government today. The government should serve the will of the people. These are three basic concepts of government, and you'll see how these things kind of evolve and how they carry forward, and how these different types of government are argued for, argued against, and how they kind of carry forward throughout American history. Looking at some of these landmark English documents, we have the Magna Carta. This brings out some important ideas like trial by jury, due process of law, things that you and I, if we're not getting in trouble every day, probably take for granted. But if you ever do end up getting in trouble or having to deal with the law, you're probably going to be very thankful that the ideas of trial by jury and due process were brought over with the Magna Carta. We also have the Petition of Right. These ideas here, ideas like no martial law in times of peace, that's pretty important. If you know anything about martial law, it's pretty strict. You may see things like, military or police kind of parading across the streets and making sure that people aren't, doing things wrong or being out. Doing that, maybe in times of war or in times of, craziness might make sense. But in times of peace, that's where it's nice to have this clause of no martial law during times of peace. No quartering of troops in private homes. We see that this is going to be an issue anyway, even though it's brought over in a landmark English document. Quartering of troops in private homes is going to be an issue at a certain point. And then we have an English Bill of Rights in 1688. A lot of these ideas prohibited standing army in peacetime unless approved by Parliament. Again, some things that you'll see that even though these documents are happening, you might see some of those issues arising. Guarantees of free trial, freedom of excessive bail, and cruel and unusual punishment. So freedom of excessive bail, if you steal, I don't know, let's transport back to when everybody was like, I don't know, using like molasses and tea. If you steal a little bit of tea, I can't, put you on a bail of like $10 million, right? Because it doesn't make sense. It doesn't match the crime. Cruel and unusual punishment, I'm certain that there was some back in the day, but nowadays it's usually, it's pretty good at making sure that we're not exercising cruel and unusual punishment. This would be like if I was like, I don't know, you stole a bag of tea. Well, you have to go swim 25 miles in the ocean or something weird like that. Whatever it might be, it's unusual or it's cruel or it doesn't match. You have to go walk on broken glass, right? It doesn't match. It doesn't make any sense. So that's some of the things that come forward a little bit with the English Bill of Rights. Coming of independence. So up until 1760, the colonies had reasonable freedom. So up until 1760, they were kind of chilling. London was very, very far away. There wasn't really, a lot of backlash or a lot of, enforcement. There was obviously some control that London and Britain had. But the distance definitely played a factor. It's very difficult to enforce laws 3,000 miles away. As you can imagine, a long distance relationship is difficult to maintain. So try and govern a nation from 3,000 miles away. So you could see that could maybe be an issue. It's no different, right? Bribing, colonists' ability to bend royal governors to their will by not voting for the money for their salary until they agree to their policies. So a little bit of strong arming, right? Hey, if you don't agree to our policies, good luck getting paid, essentially. They often say that if you can control the money, then you have a lot of power. So that's something that colonists took to their advantage. However, things change. In 1760, King George III comes to power and began dealing more firmly with the colonists. He came in, he saw that the British were being pushed around by their little brother, essentially, at the time at least, and came in and said, hey, how about we do taxation without representation? As you see all the time, that kind of no taxation without representation, that comes up a lot. That's something that comes up a lot. So people do have an opposition to taxes placed on them from London. As you can imagine, if you're all the way over here in America and you have people that are 3,000 miles away telling you what you need to pay and making you pay exorbitant taxes, you could probably be pretty annoyed by that. But King George does it. He comes in, he's like, all right, no more being pushed around. There is some growing colonial unity. We have some things that you're probably used to seeing or things that you've heard of before in the past. The Stamp Act, basically requiring the use of stamps on all legal documents, business agreements, and newspapers. This raises the price. It's a little tax. If you're getting a newspaper, you're not just paying for the newspaper now you have to pay for the stamp on top of it. The Declaration of Rights and Grievances. So this is the first time that a significant number of colonists joined to oppose the British government. You'll hear this Declaration of Rights, or a list of grievances. This is something that becomes kind of a common theme. Grievances are like things that annoy you, things that, maybe things that King George III that it has done that are irritating you, are making you mad, are making your life worse, right? We have the Boston Massacre of 1770. This is eventually used as propaganda to unify the colonists against the British. Yes, people died. Was it a massacre? Debated, right? When we think of a massacre, at least when I think of a massacre, it's like a large amount of death, right? The Boston Massacre was a lot, it's an important situation. It's sad that somebody died, of course, but there's definitely some evidence that this is kind of blown up a little bit more to say like, hey, look at this, look at the way that the British are treating us. Look at the way that they massacred us, right, in the streets. So that's something that's used as kind of like a rallying cry. We have the Boston Tea Party. This is something that you're probably familiar with as well. Bunch of people, bunch of hoodlums, right, getting together and throwing tea into the harbor. This has to do a lot with the tea tax, right? Some stuff that, price of tea was raising and getting super high. So what are we going to do? Well, let's show a way to protest. Let's throw that tea in the harbor. And that is a significant in unifying the radicals with the merchants, because you have to remember that it's not just the common people who are suffering from a lot of these taxes, but also merchants who make their money in selling a lot of these things. People, if things are too expensive, at a certain point, they're not going to buy them. And it can kind of cripple the economy a little bit, at least for the merchants. The First Continental Congress, a second Declaration of Rights. You can see this is in 1774. We're getting a lot closer to what we're probably used to as a pretty significant date in American history. A second Declaration of Rights protesting colonial policies was written, urged colonies to refuse all trade with England. Right? It's urging the colonies to refuse all trade with England. This would probably be pretty annoying for England. The colonies are kind of like a money pit, not in a bad way, but in a way that it's a good cash grab. You can get a lot of money from the colonies. You're able to tax them exorbitant amounts. You're basically able to boss them around all the time. So when they start to go against you, it can be a little bit of an issue. The reason why this is important is because this is people getting together and having a written out protest, right? first off, you're there and you're kind of implicating yourself in the crime of treason and several other things, but it's showing a growing confidence in maybe the ability to organize. We have the Second Continental Congress in 1775. They created a Continental Army. That's a big step, right? That's a big step. 1775, as you know, in 76, we're going to see some pretty dramatic changes. But they appoint our guy, George Washington, right? The first commander-in-chief. This is the nation's first national government. It served from adoption of the Declaration of Independence until the adoption of the Articles of Confederation. So this is going to stick around for a little while. There are weaknesses with this form of government, obviously, which is why they do move on to a different form at a certain point. But then there's some weaknesses with that form as well. So the point is that we are not yet at where, we have not undergone all the transitions that we've gone through up until this point. There will be more. Okay. So George Washington comes in. He is the commander-in-chief. He's the guy in charge of the Continental Army. And then, lo and behold, adopted July 4th. We all know that date, 1776, the Declaration of Independence, proclaimed the existence of a new nation. Your bell ringer was basically saying, what is the purpose of the Declaration of Independence? Well, it's proclaiming the existence of a new nation. It is declaring independence from Britain. The purpose of the Declaration of Independence is basically to formally say, all right, this is happening. We are our own nation. It's written almost entirely by Thomas Jefferson. Other authors include John Adams, Roger Sherman, Robert Livingston, good old Ben Franklin. And it opens with the intent to be independent. So make no mistake, King George III, when you read this, the first thing that you're going to read is our intentions to be independent. On top of that, it also discusses individual rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, things that you get to take advantage of even today in the year 2021. We also have state constitutions again. So once you start this government, there's other things that are going to come out. You're transitioning from colonies to states, and you're creating this United States of America. You have the Constitution, state constitution. So a constitution is a body of fundamental laws setting out the principles, structures, and processes of their government. In 1776 and in 1777, most of the states adopted individual state constitutions. New Hampshire was the first to adopt in 1776, getting ahead of a lot of things. And then Massachusetts adopts a constitution in 1780. It's actually the oldest written constitution in place in the world today. So I guess, I don't know a ton about Massachusetts, but they must have done something right there if they're not changing it around too much. Features of a lot of these constitutions, things like popular sovereignty. The government can only govern with the consent of the governed. Sounds pretty nice, something that you deal with today. We elect our officials. The government is only able to do their job if we allow them to do it. Limited government. It is effective in a lot of ways, but it restricts government action. You might not be able to get as much government aid, or if the government needs to, intervene with something, it might be an issue. Civil rights and liberties. Individuals' rights must always be granted. That's a positive, a check right there. Separation of powers and checks and balances. System calling for separation of branches of government and allowing for the monitoring of one another. So instead of just having one single branch of government that controls everything, we have three different branches, right? And that's some stuff that we see today, the checks and balances, right? We see that oftentimes the Supreme Court can have a check on the executive branch with the president. We see this often, okay? These different branches and different sections of government keep each other accountable so that nobody gets too much power and we don't go back to the kind of totalitarian monarchy that we dealt with King George III, right? The Articles of Confederation. Some of you may know about this, some of you may not. They were approved on November 15th, 1777. They established a firm league of friendship among the states. See how that turns out later on. Came together for common defense, security of liberties, mutual welfare, right? So we have this Articles of Confederation and perpetual union between the states, right? This is kind of a very beginning of a lot of this stuff. Under the government of the Articles, the governing body, only a Congress, okay, unicameral, so that's just one house, different than what we're dealing with today. One delegate from each state, regardless of population, chosen yearly by the state. So there are term limits. You see stuff like that. That's maybe a positive. The president would be the presiding officer and was chosen by members of Congress. So again, this is not quite where we're at in our year of 2020. Things are still changing and evolving. As for the powers under the government of the Articles, they could make war and peace, make treaties, borrow money, establish currency, establish post offices, fix weights and measures, build a navy, raise an army, settle disputes among the states. They could do all these things, right? Ton of different things. What they could not do was tax and regulate commerce. That's a big deal. That's a huge deal. In fact, when you look at some of the weaknesses of the Articles, that's the first one that we're going to talk about. Can't tax. You can only raise money by borrowing from the states. So the only way that you're getting money is by, asking politely, please, right? Can I borrow some of that money? Indiana, which isn't in the picture at the time, but could I please borrow some of that money? Massachusetts, I guess, right? Could not regulate interstate trade, major factor leading to the Constitution. Could not make states obey the articles of or the laws made by Congress. Again, one more time, could not make states obey the articles or laws made by Congress. Again, please, will you listen to us? No? Oh, okay. Articles could not be changed without consent of all 13 state legislatures, which basically proved to be impossible. No amendments made, even today with our Constitution and, everything that we're dealing with. Amendments are still difficult. But even back then, it was difficult as well, even with 13 state legislatures. A lot of these weaknesses lead to new issues, things like rebellion. The Articles of the Confederation cannot fully unite the new states after the revolution is over because there's so many different problems with it. So we have this thing, Shays Rebellion. In Western Massachusetts, farmers are in debt and are being put into debtor's prison, which is basically, you're super in debt. You're in debtor's prison now. You're kind of locked up. Daniel Shays united a group of farmers with the goal of shutting down the government of Massachusetts. The government under the Articles is not able to put down the rebellion. If you remember, they can't really interfere too much in these state issues. In fact, it's the responsibility of the militia of the state of Massachusetts to stop this rebellion. So they don't get that government help. It's kind of crazy. You have maybe this commander in chief in Washington, and you have kind of an army and stuff, but you can't. There's nothing they can do. It's not allowed within the Constitution or within the Articles of Confederation. Only through bad luck does the rebellion fail, but it shows the need for new government. I mean, imagine if Daniel Shays had the technology that we have today. If Daniel Shays was able to get on farmersonly.com, this might have been a different story. But Shay fails, and it shows that we have a new rebellion, a new set of laws and government that we need to get to. All right, so that's when we go to the Constitutional Convention. This began on May 25th, 1787. 12 of the 13 states sent delegates, all but Rhode Island. I guess they thought they were too cool for us. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, contributed most and kept close record of the work. He's a very smart guy, very interesting guy, James Madison. The father of the Constitution, contributing a lot of work and keeping a close record. In debating the structure, a point of contention, a point of issue, something that people were mad about. How should the states be represented in Congress? The Virginia plan comes out and says we need a bicameral legislature. That's two houses, right? Not just the one that we're usually dealing with. We need two houses with representation determined by each state's population. So Virginia, obviously, as you might imagine, has a pretty decent population during this time. So this would make sense for them. Why not? Have everything determined by population. New Jersey, significantly smaller, says we need a single house unicameral legislature with all states represented equally. Makes sense for Jersey. So what do, right? What's the compromise that we hit there? Something that we'll talk about in just a moment. But even more than that, we have this other point of contention in the one of the first big debates about the issues that we're seeing with slavery in the United States. Should slaves be counted in the populations of the southern states? Southern states are saying yes, of course, why not? Northern states are saying no. Northern states are probably saying, wow, it's very convenient that all of a sudden you want to view these people as people when it benefits you. Southern states obviously are having an issue with the idea of representation by population because, as crazy as it might sound, Southern states actually don't have that high of a population when you don't count African Americans or slaves, right? When you don't count slaves during this time, Southern states actually have a very low population in a lot of areas. So a plan that goes by representation by each state population would be pretty detrimental to the power that Southern states hold. So what do? They had the Connecticut Compromise, right? AKA the Great Compromise. You probably know it better by that. We have this bicameral legislature. So they say, okay, Virginia plan, 2 houses makes sense. We'll have a smaller house, which is the Senate, which will have all equal representation, something that we see today. We'll have the larger house, that's the House of Representatives, and that's going to be based on state population, all right, something that we see today as well. Now to the southern states. We have for you a 3/5 compromise. All free people should be counted, all right, so we're like, yeah, count all your free people, but 3/5 of all other people should be counted. 60% of the total number of slaves counted towards a state's population count for representation. So this is it's a compromise. It's a way to work through something, but just for a moment, remember and realize how awful that is to look at a human being and say, well, for the purpose of this, you're 3/5 of a human being, right? So don't get lost in that. Don't forget that, right? It's definitely a terrible, terrible thing. We have this fight for ratification. The Federalists favor the Constitution. These are people like James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, if you've ever seen Hamilton or listened to any of the music, it's kind of catchy. John Jay. They stress the weaknesses of the Articles and importance of a strong central government. So you have people coming out saying like, hey, we need changes to the Articles. There's something that's kind of going wrong here. I think that we need to fix some things. And they're headed by by those guys right there. The Anti-Federalists, they oppose the Constitution. So we have the Federalists in favor, Anti-Federalists opposing the Constitution. You have people like Patrick Henry, Sam Adams, John Hancock, right? They objected because there's no mention of God. There's no allowance for printing of money. And they thought the central government was too strong. They wanted the Bill of Rights. So there's some things on there that you might see and you'd be like, all right, is that really a big deal? But other things there too, like it kind of makes sense. You want a Bill of Rights. It's okay to think that, you don't always have to be a strong supporter of central government. So I think that that's an okay thing to maybe oppose and think about changing, right? Printing money is a big issue too as well. So yeah, you see these two things, these two sides of the camp kind of going at it and thinking of ways to deliberate and figure out a solution. As for the ratification in the states, on June 1788, 9 states, which is the majority, but without the support of New York and Virginia, they couldn't actually succeed. 9 states come together and say, hey, let's ratify. There's a little bit of stress and a little bit of like, is this actually going to work? New York is the last key state to ratify, and then North Carolina and Rhode Island follow. Again, Rhode Island kind of at the end of the pack. What does that say about Rhode Island? We have the Federalist Papers, written by Hamilton, Madison, and Jay in support of the Constitution. This is read these papers. This is why the Constitution will work. Read these papers. I put everything into this. This is going to work. Read these papers and it will make you understand. If anybody, again, has seen anything about Hamilton, you'll know that Madison wrote a decent amount of the papers. John Jay wrote a decent amount of the papers, but a large amount of the papers were written by Alexander Hamilton. He was kind of an incessant writer, something that's kind of a common theme throughout that entire play. And then finally, inaugurating the new government, New York is chosen as a temporary capital. This is going to be important later on. Obviously, it's not our capital today, and you'll see why later on when, if you get to the point of Civil War and what's going on there and what happens afterwards, right? Leading up to it at least. Right. And then George Washington becomes the first president of the United States in 1789. Numero uno, number 1. All right. That is what we have for today. this is kind of where our government started and where our government took its place to. And you see, it starts off very early government stuff. And then by the end, you kind of get to something that you and I are probably a lot more familiar with. Okay, so that is what we got for today. And that is going to be it.